Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We continue our reading of Islamic constitutionalism and Maulana Maududi. Despite this insistence on Islam as a complete and unique system, Maulana Maududi's liberal discourses, Maulana Maududi endorses the use of liberal discourses and institutions as political technology. The liberal discourses would include liberal discourses will include ideology, so there's justification of human rights, obviously with limitations on Islamic grounds, but those are limitations, not rejections. Democracy itself, so these are as far as ideology is concerned. So there is a limited critique of human rights ideology, of democracy, and discourses on freedom, but what we get is a limitation and not a total rejection of these ideologies. Limitations in terms of Islamic values. So we don't get a positive Islamic view on these matters. Rather, we have a limitation of existing liberal views. And then political technology, so the instruments in voting, so those are among instrument parliament. That's the huge parliament is justified on the basis of the conception of shura. And there is some critique of the institution of parliament on Islamic ground, but that's also a negative critique in the sense of it just limits what parliament can do. But there's no full rejection of the institutions of parliament, and the alternative Islamic institutions are not justified or presented. Similarly, the liberal state is endorses with its all three institutions: army, police and bureaucracy, and its legal system, with Islamic limitations, of course. But that's the basic endorsement of liberal institutions. There's no positive conception of Islamic State and all that, and alternative institutions. So you are limiting the supposed negativity of liberal institutions. So you are basically Islamizing liberal institutions. And among political technologies, one glaring lack is the process. Any discourse on processes, election campaigns, for example. Obviously, there is a discourse on election campaigns in terms of whether they are, what are there any limitations on them, etc. But the process, democratic process, and the politics of rights are not seen as socialization processes, and that's a glaring omission in Maulana Maududi's discourse. So these are a few examples. I didn't try to be exhaustive, since some of these will come during our discussions, but just wanted to mention some of these to give you an idea what we are talking about. So his conception of Islamic democracy is of a political order in which every individual is an equal participant in Khilafat. And in Maulana Maududi, there is a strange conception that we are somehow Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in some sense. The sense of representative of. Which is actually a totally wrong conception. And even in his tafsir, when he talks about tafsir of Surah Al-Baqarah, tafsir of ayah, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. There, Khalifa is, there we get the idea. Maybe we will read that at some point. If I remember correctly, it has been a long time since I read the Fihim al-Quran. We get the idea that somehow Adam al-Islam and his descendants are Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a Khilafat Rabbani, but that doesn't mean a representation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Hayy al-Qayyum. Nobody needs it. He doesn't need any representation. And if you look at classical books on political philosophy and political theory, al-Khilafa is described as niyabat on Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Khilafa, if there is any Khilafa, al-Khilafa as an institution, that's the niyaba, that's the representation, or more than that, not representation, but what's the correct word? Niyaba can be representation. So representation of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his inheritance. And not the representation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anyhow, his conception of Islamic democracy is of a political order in which every individual is equal participant in Khalifa. So Khalifa is somehow Khalifa in Maulana Maududi's discourse resembles an autonomous individual. The only thing is that autonomy is limited by, again, there's a limitation. So I might be wrong here, but that's my understanding, and we'll revise it as we go along. Khalifa for Maulana Maududi is a citizen, an autonomous individual or mini sovereign. The only difference is this sovereignty is not absolute. This autonomy is not absolute. And obviously, even in liberal discourse, that autonomy and that sovereignty is not absolute. It is limited by the similar autonomy of another individual or another citizen. But for Maududi, it is further limited by Islamic law. But that limitation is, again, negative limitation in the sense that you are not rejecting the conception and you are not presenting an alternative conception. You are endorsing or Islamizing an existing conception in such a way that it becomes somehow compatible with Islam. So in that sense, it is a negative conception. Like Islamic banking, for example, you're not giving us an alternative system. What you're doing is justifying existing institution by putting some limitations on it. And even though, legally it might be fine, but like you don't build an Islamic society by putting limitation on foreign conception. You build an Islamic society and civilization through institutionalizing your own positive concepts. Because when you are putting limits, it just means that you are living in non-Muslim society. You are treating it as an eternal fact. Okay. So, and as I was saying, it turns out that I was correct. While Maududi also find room for personal autonomy within Islamic order, political within legal constraints. Every individual, by legal constraint he means Islamic constraints, Islamic legal constraint. Every individual has full freedom. So conception of freedom is also endorsed to choose his way of life. So this is pure liberalism with some limitation. Endorsements of liberal value of the autonomy and equality leads to an endorsement of liberal institutions. The president must be elected by the Muslims. The election must reflect the free, uncoerced will of the Muslims. Maududi argues that that a well-defined and permanent shura, representative of muhajirin. Anyway, so the conception of autonomy and equality and freedom is endorsed here. Liberal conception of autonomy. I think we'll stop here because related, but another topic is coming up. Although I did mention already the endorsement of Parliament. But it's a slightly different topic and needs a bit more focus, so we'll start with it next time, inshallah.